What is the Old Testament about? We've begun a series of videos just trying to introduce you to the story of the Old Testament, which is a story first and foremost about God. God is the hero. You'll never understand your Old Testament or your Bible until you understand that. It's a story about Jesus. God is revealing how he is going to accomplish salvation through Jesus. And it's a story about a kingdom. We get the first picture of that kingdom in Genesis 1 and 2, this perfect world, God's people in God's place, experiencing God's blessing and God's presence forever. That's how one scholar defines the kingdom. But we don't see that picture for very long because man rebels against God in Genesis chapter 3. And he brings absolute brokenness into this world. Our relationship with God is broken. Our relationship with one another is broken. Our relationship with the world itself is broken. And we might be hopeless, except for the fact that God comes and pursues man. And even as he's explaining the consequences of man's sin, he gives hope by making a promise that he is going to send a seed, a descendant of the woman who will defeat Satan. And yet, as we move from Genesis 3 to Genesis 4, the story becomes very sad very quickly. We have that hope, but as we look at this world and as we look at man, man is truly a mess. Man murders his brother, brother against brother. First major act of rebellion in Genesis chapter 4, and then it just gets worse from there. Genesis 5 is death and judgment until we come to Genesis 6 and we see that man is engaged in some perverted plot with demonic beings, and God looks at man and he's sorry that he made man, and he says that every intention of his heart is only evil continually. And once again, as we look at man, we might wonder, is God done? And certainly God is angry, and we see that God decides to judge the earth. And yet in the middle of that judgment, God shows mercy and rescues one family. And you know the story, I'm sure. God floods the earth. In other words, waters cover the earth, because that's what a flood does, right? And that brings us, in a sense, all the way back to where the world started, actually. It's almost like in this judgment, God uncreates the earth, and then he recreates it again, or at least that's the picture. I guess maybe to say it a different way, God gives the world a bath, after which the text tells us an ark, a boat, comes to rest on the mountain, and God takes Noah out into this new world and makes him a promise. Specifically, he makes him a covenant. And that word covenant is a key word for understanding your Bible. That is the point. The Bible is a story of God's kingdom, which is explained to us or revealed to us through a series of covenants. And we find this first covenant in Genesis chapter 9, where God says to Noah and his sons, "Behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you." And that word covenant, as I'm saying, is really important. That's why I'm even telling you this story, and yet I know that it's also kind of unfamiliar. What is a covenant? How would you define that word? A covenant is basically a promise, but not a promise like I'll come to your house tomorrow. It's more a formal promise. It's something like a contract, actually, but a contract doesn't necessarily involve a relationship, and yet a covenant always does, which is why you don't talk about marriage as a marriage contract so much as you talk about the covenant of marriage. It's a legally binding obligation, a covenant, like a contract, but it's more personal in that it involves a certain kind of unique relationship. And in the Old Testament, there were different kinds of covenants. If you're just looking at covenants in general, for example, you might have a covenant between equals, which is an agreement between people who are basically on the same level. Then you also have a covenant in the Old Testament, which is a relationship, a covenant between someone who is a superior and another person who is an inferior. So a powerful nation might enter into a covenant with a weaker nation, and that covenant was a formal relationship between the two. And most of the time in the world of men, that would mean that the superior nation expected, demanded certain things from the inferior one. We'll make a covenant to protect you if you, the inferior nation, will do these things that we want. And if you keep the covenant, you will be blessed. And if you don't, you will be cursed. But there's another kind of covenant which is different that could be made between a superior and an inferior, where the more powerful one would actually make commitments to the less powerful one. The first kind of covenant we might call a treaty. The second kind of covenant we might call a gift or a grant. And that's the kind of covenant that God makes with Noah in Genesis 9. It's not a treaty, it's a grant, it's a gift, because God's more important than Noah, and so Noah doesn't have the right to demand anything of God, and yet God graciously stoops down to make a promise to Noah and to all of Noah's descendants, and to the animals even, and in a sense to the earth itself. You can see that in Genesis 9 and 10. Who does God say he's making this covenant with? Genesis chapter 9, verses 9 and 10. Behold, I establish this covenant with you, with your offspring, with every living creature, with every beast of the earth with you, as many as came out of the earth, out of the ark. In the Noahic covenant, God is making a commitment to the world. And what is the essence of this covenant? God describes it in Genesis 8:21. He says, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seedtime and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. In chapter 9, verse 11, he gets more specific. He says, I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. God promises that he will never destroy the earth through a flood again, the way that he did here in Genesis chapter 6 through 8, which is pretty important because after Adam sinned, the world got really bad and God judged it. And that's good, right? Because those people were evil. They were doing weird things that we're not even sure we understand. And yet as we think about that judgment, we're kind of like, whoa, what if the world gets that bad again? It makes you wonder. I know God made a promise to defeat Satan, but that promise is not going to mean much if there's no people left on the planet because they've gotten so evil that God's just wiped them out. So towards the beginning of the Bible, God commits that no, he's not going to be doing this over and over and over again the next couple thousand years. He's committed to creation, not just to cursing, but to blessing. He's going to patiently allow this world to remain until he provides the solution that he's promised for what man's done. And you know, it's cool if you're reading the story because this is like start over. In Genesis 9, he basically reaffirms the whole plan he shared in Genesis 1, and he gives Noah very similar commands to the ones he gave Adam. So he's putting Noah in the world the way he put Adam. What are some of the similarities that come to mind between Noah and Adam and Eve? Adam and Eve were the only people on the planet. Noah and his family are the only people on the planet. It's kind of an obvious one. Adam and Eve were in the garden on the mountain. Noah and his family come out of the ark on the mountain. Adam and Eve were perfect and experienced fellowship with God. And while Noah wasn't perfect, he was a righteous man and he walked with God. God commands Adam, to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And you know what? He makes the same exact command to Noah. Only now it's in a world under the curse. And so there has to be some modifications. And God has to talk to Noah about some things he never had to talk to Adam about. And yet you still can't help as you're reading and looking at Noah on this mountain to wonder if Noah will be able to do what Adam couldn't. Is he the seed? The word Noah, we said, sounds like the Hebrew word for rest. And you remember that was life in the kingdom at the end of Genesis 1, rest. And so you're looking at Noah in this new world, wondering if he's the promised one who is going to bring the promised rest. After all, that's his name. And yet it doesn't take you long to discover he's not going to be able to establish the kingdom, because just like Adam in the garden ate of the fruit of the tree and ended up naked and ashamed, not too long after Noah comes out of the ark, he eats of the fruit of the vine and ends up naked and ashamed. And from that point on, once again, the world just keeps getting worse and worse. After the reboot, it's just like the same old story. It's Genesis 3-6 all over again, until basically everyone joins in rebellion against God, refusing to submit to God's authority over them by trying to establish the kingdom for themselves. And this is Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel. And Babel's a city. And you know, in the Old Testament, every other time you read this word Babel, how it's translated Babylon. The reason they translated Babel here is because the word Babel sounds a lot like the Hebrew word for the judgment God brought on the people. So it's a word play, but you really could call this the Tower of Babylon. And what's happening in the Tower of Babylon is basically the same thing that was happening in the Garden of Eden, only on a grand scale. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve sinned, trying to be like God. And at the Tower of Babel, you have the whole earth coming together to exalt themselves over God. And what do they say they want to make for themselves in Genesis 11:4? They want to make a name for themselves. Adam and Eve wanted to be God, meaning they wanted to have the ability to define good and evil for themselves. And at the Tower of Babylon, everyone is gathering together and basically saying that they're defining good and evil now, only in the exact opposite way, as God has said. God said, I want you to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And at the Tower of Babel, people said, no, that's not good for us, which of course is why God stoops down once again and judges man. And yet, even as he judges man in Genesis chapter 11, once again, we find him taking another step forward in his great restoration plan. Every time man does his worst, every time it looks like man's done the single most evil thing he could possibly do, God steps in and uses that moment to take another step forward in his plan for fixing what man has broken. When Adam and Eve sin, he makes a promise to defeat Satan. When the whole world goes crazy doing evil things, he rescues Noah and reaffirms his commitment to creation. And when people join together to shake their fist at God, God chooses an old man to use to rescue the universe. If you look at Genesis 11:10, you'll see this section starts with a genealogy. These are the generations of Shem, which might seem boring, but the thing is, this genealogy gives hope, because what's it saying? It's saying, in the middle of this chaos, don't forget the promise God made about the seed of the woman, because God hasn't. He's still at work, preserving a line through which he's going to send someone to rescue us. And at the end of Genesis 11, we see God doing that as he chooses an old man from a place called Ur of the Chaldeans, which was actually part of, do you know what important part of the world Ur of the Chaldeans was in? And this is important because of the rest of the Old Testament. It's part of the world of Babylon. And God chooses this old man from Babylon and makes him some of the most important promises in the entire Bible. And we call these promises the Abrahamic covenant. And this is the second covenant we find in the Bible. And as we get together next time, we'll begin looking at this covenant in which God makes his great saving plan even more clear.